Almroth from the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. I may have pronounced that wrong. Bethany, please correct me if I got your university title wrong. We have Alexandra Caterbow, who is the director of HEJsupport, which is the Health, Environment, and Justice group. We also have Jenny Gitlitz joining us today from the Berkshires in Western Mass. She's the Director of Solutions to Plastic Pollution and of Beyond Plastics. And then we also will have Sarah Au joining us from the US EPA. I'll introduce each of the speakers a little bit more fully before each of them give their presentations. For now, Pam, do we think we have most people in the room?
Yes, I think we're good.
All right. So this session is 90 minutes long. It's going to run until about 11:30 a.m. We have 4 presentations, each with a few minutes of Q&A after. And then once the presentations are over, we will go into a panel discussion. We have some prepared questions for each of our speakers, but I also encourage everyone to place questions in the chat, and we'll try to either ask them during those individual Q&As or during the greater panel discussion towards the end of the session. I would also like to make a note of, I know we're all very practiced with Zoom, but if you could just make sure that your microphones stay muted unless you are one of our speakers, that would be lovely. And yes, please feel free to use the chat to introduce yourselves, where you're coming from, and to ask any questions. So without further ado, our first speaker today is, actually didn't ask you if you like to be called Bethany or Dr. Carney Almroth, but our first speaker is Bethany Carney Almroth.
Bethany.
Okay, Bethany is a professor of ecotoxicology and environmental science at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. She is an expert on chemicals and plastic materials, as well as the fate of plastics and microplastics in the environment. She also studies the global impact of plastics within the planetary boundary framework, which she will introduce us to or talk about during her presentation. And she's also spent the last 2 years co-coordinating the Scientist Coalition for an Effective Plastics Treaty, which supports delegates and other actors in assessing and accessing robust, independent science to support their decision-making around the Global Plastics Treaty. I'm sure Bethany will describe her work and herself better than I will, but without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let Bethany take over.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And I'm just gonna share my screen. That's the hard part, to get that right. And slideshow.
So if you go into slide mode, I think that will be...
Are we good?
Great, looks wonderful.
Okay. Perfect. Okay, so you already heard who I am. I've been working on chemical and particle pollution for more than 20 years, but on plastics specifically for 14 years. Started with microplastics and then sort of shifted into products as well. And as you heard, have been working at the policy interface for a number of years. I'm going to provide like a big overview of plastics and chemicals, and then some of the other speakers coming after me will delve into a little bit more details. But I'm happy also to answer questions or to get back in the panel discussion on some more of the in-depth work. Okay, first starting off here with what plastics are, and there's a lot of different definitions of plastics, and this is important. Oh, sorry, this is important for. I'm trying to move us so I can see my own slides. There we go. For how we're discussing this, and this is a definition that I pulled out of the Scientists Coalition response to the revised Zero draft, which is a draft in the plastics treaty negotiations that we pulled together. And we define plastic materials as being made of synthetic or semi-synthetic polymers that are used for the first time to create plastic products in any form, including thermoset, thermoplastics, elastomers, and resins from both bio-based and fossil-based feedstocks. So what's important here is that we're including both synthetic and semi-synthetic polymers, and that we're including bio-based and fossil-based feedstocks. And this is a definition, of course, for primary plastics. So secondary plastics would be those that are coming from like recycled materials, for example. And again, to set the scene, what we're talking about here, this is a paper from 2020 where the authors had tried to get an idea of how much anthropogenic materials there are on the planet and did comparisons with living materials. So at the top part of this picture, you'll see where it says animals and plastics. And at that point, I think the data is from 2015 or 16. For animals, including both terrestrial and aquatic animals, the total mass of animals on the planet was 4 gigatons. And at that time, the mass of plastics was 8 gigatons. So twice as much plastics as living animals on the planet. But today, the current estimates of plastics are around 11 gigatons. I don't know exactly how many gigatons of animals there are, but plastics production is increasing. In 2022, more than 500 million tons of plastics were produced, and that number is predicted to increase going into the future as well. Those predictions are coming out of the plastics industry themselves, calling for or pointing to the need for more plastics, but we'll get back to that. So again, setting the scene, this is another image from a publication by Levy and Cullen in 2018. And what I just wanted to show you here was how complex the situation is that we're currently facing. And this is an image showing the flows both globally and nationally of petrochemicals, including plastics. And as you can see, it's a very complex system, and we don't have a lot of transparency around this. So it's a very highly complex system with low transparency, and there are a lot of knowledge gaps, which makes it difficult for us to follow chemicals and products through their life cycle and through these global markets. And then on the other end of that, and the waste side, we also see very complex systems. And there have been changes in waste regulations over the past few years. I'm sure you know that China, for example, stopped taking mixed plastic wastes in 2018. The EU recently banned exports of mixed plastic waste to non-OECD countries, but we also know that there's a big black market here. There's a lot of plastics that we really don't know where they're going, where they're ending up, and even a lot of the reporting protocols don't capture all of the plastic that might be in other products, like mixed paper, for example, or in textiles. We also know that there are few or no regulations controlling the import of secondary plastics. And regarding chemicals, most regulations will target only substances of very high concern, so that a lot of the chemicals are not being reported or followed. So again, high complexity, low transparency, a lot of knowledge gaps. This is an image from a paper that was published earlier this year under the lead of Martin Wagner in the Plast Chem project. In the pie chart, you'll see a depiction of chemicals that are used or present in plastics. So these are used both in the production of the plastics materials and in products. And they documented more than 16,000 chemicals that can be used in plastics. They cross-checked that list with hazard databases, and they found that 4,219 of those 16,000 chemicals have hazardous properties, while more than 10,000 lack data. So we don't really know if they're hazardous, and if so, how. They identified 161 chemicals as not hazardous, but those assessments were based on incomplete data. So essentially, you can draw the conclusion from this study that there's no safe chemicals. That's a very difficult word and difficult to define what safe is. But if you look on the other side of the chart where you see the Saki diagram, you can see what kinds of toxicity those 4,000 hazardous chemicals have. It includes aquatic toxicity, specific target organ toxicity, cancerogenic, mutagenic, reprotoxic, endocrine disrupting, persistent, bioaccumulative, mobile, and toxic. So these are the kinds of categories that are used to describe hazardous properties of chemicals in a lot of different legal frameworks. So this is the situation that we're talking about. And then if we're going to talk about regulating plastics, we have to understand the life cycle of plastics. And the treaty, which we've already mentioned, did call for addressing plastics through the full life cycle. And this is an image on the left side of the screen from the Scientist Coalition that we've mentioned, where we're defining plastics as beginning with extraction and production. So fossil fuel-based resources or bio-based carbon sources that are used for polymer production, then through to manufacturing, transport and trade, which occurs at all stages of the plastics life cycle, into commercial, industrial, and consumer use. And here we include all three just to really drive home the point that plastics are not only used by consumers. A lot of times people, the general public, will know which products they are using, but not really be aware of what's going on in other sectors or what's going on in other parts of the plastics life cycle. Then, of course, waste management or mismanagement, and here recycling can be included. And finally, removal and remediation of contaminated environments. And we also know that we do have a lot of plastics being released or emissions occurring throughout this entire life cycle. So here I've included some images from different stages in the life cycle. So that first image you might recognize from the train wreck in Ohio with the train that was carrying vinyl chloride, the precursor to polyvinyl chloride. The image below that is from a shipwreck off the coast of Sri Lanka, where a ship that was carrying raw plastic nurdles, so virgin plastics plus plastics chemicals, caught fire and sank. And as you can see, the people on the beach there are knee deep in plastic nurdles. So these are these small beads that are maybe 3 to 5 millimeters. Then we have the use phase in a lot of different sectors. The top photograph is from the store closest to my home where we grocery shop, and it's like almost impossible to buy food that's not wrapped in plastics, at least where I am right now. Fishing gear, obviously, and I included paint just as an example because that's thought to be one of the major sources of microplastics in the environment, like paint chips. And then finally, a photograph from a dump site, and that's a photograph I took myself at Dandora, which is in Kenya, and one of the biggest dumps in Eastern Africa. And here you can see quite a lot of textiles that are accumulating in this environment. And emissions of chemicals and particles and plastic objects, both micro, meso, and macroplastics, occur throughout this entire life cycle. This image here is based on the planetary boundaries framework, which you heard Agnes introduce in the beginning. And this is from a publication which we released last week, actually. And around the outside of this ring, you'll see 8 different categories, and in the middle, you'll have novel entities. And these are the 9 categories of the planetary boundaries framework, which aims to understand how human and anthropogenic activities are affecting Earth systems, the biogeophysical systems of the planet Earth, and destabilizing those to a point which moves us beyond a system that has redundancy. We're moving outside of the safe operating space and we're affecting the function of the planet. So most of you probably will have heard of this with regards to climate change, for example, and that we've moved beyond the safe operating space into tipping points. What we've done here is put plastics and novel entities, which means new things, in the center, and then did literature searches looking for mechanisms or scientific evidence showing mechanisms of how plastics are causing changes in the other boundaries. So, for example, we see plastics connected to climate change through fossil fuel use, greenhouse gas releases that are occurring both in the production stage, but also in the use and incineration, degradation stages, burning. We see also impacts on carbon sequestration in the oceans and in the marine carbon pump with marine snow. There's evidence of changes in albedo in Arctic systems where particles are affecting the reflective properties of ice, for example. In terms of biodiversity, if I take that as one more example, we can see the toxicity of the particles and the chemicals in plastics that are affecting animals. And we also see changes in microbial communities and functions growing on the plastic particles or plastic materials in the environment, and those communities differ from other materials. We also see an increased sequestration of antibiotic resistance genes on plastics, and plastics have led to movement of invasive species, including pathogens like E. coli and Vibrio. And then when it comes to humans, we know that chemicals used in plastics do impact human health. This is from a report released by UNEP and BRS. There's quite a lot of data on plastics chemicals impacting human health. We're exposed via a lot of different products throughout our entire lifespans, from in utero and fetal stages throughout our entire lifespans. And there's robust data showing that certain categories of these 16,000 chemicals do impact our health. For example, with phthalates, with some of the UV stabilizers, with brominated flame retardants, and so on. We know that plastics chemicals are impacting our hormone systems, they're reducing fertility, they're having negative health impacts on cardiovascular disease, affecting different kinds of cancers. So there's robust data there. Then if we talk about micro and nanoplastics, this is a bit more of an emerging field where data is newer and there's still some development going on in detection methodologies for finding these particles in human tissue samples, but there's early evidence indicating that, yes, we are exposed. Exactly how much we're exposed to and the size of those particles is still being determined as we're developing methods to do this, but we know that we are exposed, and plastics have been identified in a myriad of different human tissue samples. There's also a number of early studies indicating that there might be some health impacts, but again, this is a new emerging field. I think the research is not more than 5 years old here. So I think we'll see more developments in this research field as we go forward, but there seems to be from the animal studies, from aquatic studies where we've been doing this research for 10, 15 years, we know the kinds of mechanisms that micro nanoparticles can cause impacts via, for example, oxidative stress, inflammation, via chemical mechanisms and so on. So there's reason to believe that these same mechanisms will also be occurring in humans. And all of this knowledge led us to the space where we are now around the plastics treaty negotiations. So understanding the global pollution of plastics, there's literally no place on the planet left that is not contaminated, from the atmosphere to the deep oceans to the human bodies. So this was adopted in 2022, and 175 countries signed the resolution to develop an international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution, including in the marine environment. I know I'm going to Korea in a few days for the final planned meeting, the 5th meeting for this treaty negotiation. And we're not done yet. We'll see what happens in the next couple of weeks to see where this treaty lands. But our scientist coalition, which now consists of more than 400 scientists from 65 countries, just if we just put it in a sort of a big picture thing, if our goal is to protect human health and environmental health, we're going to need to reduce non-essential plastics. We're going to have to reduce unsafe and unsustainable production and consumption patterns. We need to increase transparency and responsibility around all of these products and the impacts. We have to improve compliance mechanisms, and we can potentially apply a sectoral approach, looking at plastics that are used in the different sectors, like packaging or like building and construction or food production, for example. But what we do know is that we need to reduce plastics production. And this has been repeated by the OECD, by Systemic, which is a consulting firm, by UNEP, by academic scientists and modelers. There was a new report released today from Eunomia reiterating the same message. We need to reduce production of plastics. There will need to be a lot of solutions along the entire life cycle, but this one is at the very beginning, at the top of the waste hierarchy: reduce production. And everybody says it. And how are we going to do this? So we have to reduce, we have to implement global targets, both mandatory targets that can be implemented at a national level. We have to reduce the overall complexity and volume of plastics being produced. We can apply the principle of chemical simplification, so getting that number of 16,000 down to something that is more manageable, increasing transparency, reporting, and traceability throughout the plastics value chain. All of this is going to require financial support and technical support. We need to make sure that the changes that we're bringing on board, and as we shift away from how we're doing things now into the future, integrate safety and sustainability. So we move into a system that is safer and more sustainable. We need to look at essentiality and how we're making decisions. We need to have standardized criteria for decision making. We need to have comprehensive regulatory frameworks that can support these actions. And we need to have mechanisms to evaluate the targets that are being set up globally and nationally. And these should be responsive. They should be able to be developed over time as we gain new knowledge and new science. There should be a body of experts working on this within the global community, led by scientists and other knowledge holders and experts. And they should be free of conflicts of interest in the questions which they are addressing. So, of course, industry has important data and knowledge here, and that they will need to participate in this work, but decision-making maybe should be done by people that are free of conflicts of interest. And I will stop there, showing you a QR code that leads you to the Scientist Coalition with our outputs, fact sheets, and policy briefs on different questions around plastics, and a photograph by my good friend Ben Van Wang, who is an artist who builds massive sculptures around different environmental problems, and is known famously for the tap, which is, as you see here, an image showing plastic production. And in the foreground there, you'll see his nephew, indicating the impacts that we have on coming generations. So thank you for that. Happy to take questions now or later.
Thank you so much, Bethany. That was an amazing overview. And I'm really excited to dig further into some of these things during the panel discussion. I don't see any questions in the chat right now, so I think I'll let people percolate a little bit and come back to ask you during the panel, if that's all right with you. Alex, Are you ready to present? While you're getting your slides ready, I will introduce our next speaker, Alex Caterbow, who is an activist with a background in environmental policy. Focus has been on international and EU chemical policy. She is the co-director of HEJsupport, which, again, please correct me if I'm pronouncing that wrong, which stands for Health, Environment, and Justice. She's an expert on chemical issues and waste issues, including the transparency and traceability of chemicals throughout products, materials, and different industries. Today, she's going to be speaking about the need for transparency in the plastics industry and her work advocating for a provision in the Plastics Treaty that specifically addresses it. And here with a great opening slide, I will turn it over to Alex.
Thank you so much, Agnes, and thank you for having me. Yeah, and also thanks to Bethany for the great overview, because that helps me a lot, and I don't need to go into details on some points because you already did. That's great. So what we're going to do now is we're going to zoom in a little bit on the transparency and traceability issue. Bethany mentioned it several times. That is a very important piece of this whole puzzle. That we need to ensure more safety and to protect environment and human health. So, okay, no, I cannot move my slides. Oh yeah, just quickly about us. Yeah, HEJsupport. We are a very small expert organization, but we work a lot with other NGOs. We are in various networks, and for a few years we focus a lot on transparency and traceability. And when I say we, it's not just HEJsupport doing this work, but we collaborate on this together with Groundwork South Africa and a Swedish Society for Nature Conservation. They are not here today, but yeah, I want to let you know it's not just us doing this work. What's the problem and why is this important? So this is like a very basic overview of what is going on. We have a situation where nobody knows what toxic chemicals are in products. Often when I talk to consumers, they are shocked because they think everything is controlled and measured and checked, and it's not. And I think this is the situation all around the world. There is no country that can do this at the moment. And to get to know what toxic chemicals are in products, we have a few ideas how we can do this. Here, one example, just quickly, why is this a problem? Here you can see, for instance, in plastic food utensils, they have been found brominated flame retardants in about 40% of the tested food contact materials. That was done by the Food Packaging Forum. And there is evidence that this is recycled waste from electrical and electronic equipment, and this is also illegal. So instead of having a lot of tests, it would be nice to be able to track these chemicals along the whole value chain and the whole life cycle. So some people say, but there's GHS. So GHS is short for the Globally Harmonized System of Classification and Labeling of Chemicals. That is a global system, but it only applies for the identity of chemicals and hazard communication in mixtures. So it's not for products. And a lot of people also in the plastic treaty negotiations, they mix this up because they think, oh, we already have a system that is working. Besides the fact that GHS is not for products, it's also voluntary. It's not being implemented in many countries. And I once tried to find material safety data sheets from several companies, and guess what? It's hard to find it. So the GHS has a lot of problems and is definitely not taking care of the problem that we want to solve. So what can we do about this? What we propose is a globally harmonized system for chemical information in manufactured materials and products. And why do we do this? Or what would be the advantage to have something like this? So it will help companies to request clear information from upstream suppliers. This becomes more and more important as we have more and more supply chain requirements also in legislation, such as the German or EU supply chain regulation that we have now, where also downstream users and brands have to report. And they cannot often because they don't have this information. So another advantage is that it will level the playing field for companies and simplify trade, and will inspire innovation and safe product design, because as you saw on my first slide, only if you know it, you can control it. So only if you know what's in there, you can find safer alternatives. It will also ensure equality before the law and eliminate double standards. And of course, it will facilitate safe recycling, as waste managers and recyclers will know what is in the products they have to deal with. And in addition to this, let's not forget about the consumers. They would be able to know and to track what, or find out what is in the products they buy. So what we already see is that there are more and more apps, for instance, where you scan a barcode and then you get certain information. So only if we have such a global system, this can be done like everywhere and by everyone. And another stakeholder group that is super important, and I will move to the next slide, is regulators. Regulators also often don't know what is in the products that they import or the products that they have on their market, especially countries in the global south, when they have no own labs and difficulties and really difficulties with resources. A global database would help them. On this slide, you see what we want is an accessible information for all. So often we hear consumers don't need all the information. It might be confusing. Yeah, but it's a prerequisite for the right to know and to give them an informed purchasing decision. It might be that we need advices that help them to do this, like apps or databases. Several NGOs already provide things like this. In the EU, we have Scan for Chem, for instance, where you can scan, but also these organizations have problems to get to the data source, and that would help them. So yeah, but how should it work? So a lot of good ideas, but how should it work? Here you can see what we envision is information that goes from each step in the supply chain to a global database. The database holds the information, and also in addition to that, there would be like a code or a label, something on the product, so a physical data carrier on the product, in addition to the information in the database, just in case this information carrier gets lost. And then this, of course, we envision this to be global because we have global markets, we have global supply chains, and it would help companies because they would only need to feed the data once and not complying with a lot of different national systems. And so the plastic treaty. How does the plastic treaty come in here? The plastic treaty provides a unique opportunity at the moment to get this implemented, this idea. And this is transparency and traceability of chemicals in plastic products and plastic materials is something that we are advocating for to be included in the plastic treaty text. So on this slide, you see more information, but I'm already a bit behind time, so I'm not gonna read this out, but
You're fine on time.
all
actually.
right, great,
Yeah.
thank you. So where do we stand at the moment? As Bethany already said, we're gonna meet in Busan in South Korea next week, and it's the last round of negotiations. And where do we stand? We managed to get a really good text into the draft, but it's all bracketed, and as you may know, the chair of the conference made a chair's proposal, but still it's in there. It's so what we also hear from different governments and also from industry actually is that this will be very useful to and a prerequisite to get other goals accomplished. Because only if you know what is in the products and materials, you might be able to substitute, to have a better product design and so on. So this is what we really want to be enshrined in the treaty text and what we are advocating for a lot. And so far, it doesn't look too bad, but in the end, you never know what is going to happen. At the moment, we don't even know if we're gonna have a plastic treaty text after INC 5. So it's all in the air, but we think this is really a good opportunity. So you may ask, is something like this already happening? Yes, there are a few approaches. I would like to highlight the EU SCIP database for substances of very high concern. It is a database where companies have to report all substances of very high concern as defined in REACH. Of course, this database could work better. For consumers, it's not very handy at the moment, and it doesn't have a product identifier. However, it shows that this huge amount of data is manageable. And it also shows that companies already report. And the EU is a huge market, so they are able to do this. A lot of sectors and companies have to do it already. So to me, this is a very good example for how to handle big data and that companies do it already. Of course, there are industry internal transparency schemes like in the automotive sector. However, these schemes are only within the supply chain. So it's not accessible for everyone, not even to regulators, not to mention consumers. This is not what we want. We want it to be accessible for all. And then you have voluntary intergovernmental systems like the UNEP Chemicals and Products Program. That was quite active, but now it's a bit sleepy. And we are also advocating for in the frame of the global framework on chemicals, which is the success of SciChem, to get an indicator there. And we already managed with governments to have a target on transparency and traceability. So as you see, it's not like, it's not rocket science. It's not something that is totally new. Here you see what are the challenges from non-harmonized standards, because we get governments to agree on that this is necessary, but then they say, oh, let's do it on a national level. it's not actually not so smart, because companies will freak out if they have to comply with so many different versions. It is costly. Trade will be more complicated, and there's a risk of double standards. So this is, in a nutshell, our idea and how we advocate for this and how it's related to the plastic treaty. And I'm happy to hear your comments and questions, and thanks for your, now the last word. I missed the last word. Sorry. For your, not patience, attention. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And yeah, I'm very interested to see how the next few weeks unfold for all of you. Yeah, it was partly, I was like, oh, we should have this conference session after that final negotiation in Busan. But I do have a quick question, and I want to ask it now, just in case going back through your slides is helpful for you. On your second to last slide, I believe you were mentioning there's, several other questions to ask about this transparency provision, one of which being, how do you ensure that the data and transparency disclosures that companies are going to do are of the same quality? And also, how would you go about managing all of that data of these disclosures? Do you think you could expand a little bit more on those challenges of making sure data is quality and making sure that the data is well managed?
Yes. Yes, this is really a challenge, especially the quality of the data. But I think if it's hosted by like a neutral place, let's say UNEP, OECD or so, and a lot of companies report, I think there will be like a process that if one company provides good data and the other one doesn't, I think I can imagine that there will be some competition. And also it will be not easy for a company that produces the same stuff like another one to do not hold up to the same level of quality as their competitors. So I think that is one thing. And then, of course, we need surveillance, we need good implementation and monitoring. I also think, I don't know if we can get this, but of course it would be great to have some sanctions if the data quality is not good enough. In the EU, in REACH, also companies have to provide data, right? We also see that the compliance is not good, but there is a possibility to take away their registration, to pose some fees or more fees on them. So that is something that could work. And managing big data, I think the SCIP database shows that it is possible. And it is unbelievable in the last 2 years how many new systems came up of tracking. So it's not only blockchain, which I think is very energy, needs a lot of energy, but there are other systems. You can even mold it in, like, so to say, the DNA of a plastic material. There are RFD systems. So there's a lot of movement in the last 2 years in this sector. So I can imagine that what we cannot envision now might be possible soon. So I think technology in this case helps a lot and is advancing fast, because everyone sees it's the logical next step.
Well, thank you very much. That was a thoughtful and hopeful answer, so I really appreciate that. And we will hear more from Alex in our panel discussion. At the moment, we are going to move to our next speaker, Jenny Gitlitz, who is the Director of Solutions to Plastic Pollution at Beyond Plastics, which is a nationwide project bringing together policy experts, grassroots activists to stem the tide of plastic pollution. Jenny spent more than 30 years developing programs, conducting research, and advocating in legislatures around recycling and green building. And today, Jenny will be sharing key findings and challenges of the plastics recycling industry. All right, Jenny, take it away.
Okay, great. Can you all hear me?
Yes, you sound loud and clear.
Very good. So good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here. And I just have to say that Bethany and Alex, those were amazing presentations. So I'm going to talk about how plastics recycling has largely been a failure in the United States. I'm going to start with some statistics from the EPA. We generated 35.7 million tons of plastic waste in 2018. That is the most recent year that we have data available for, and we're hoping that EPA is really actually kind of late with coming out with more data. Of that amount, 16% is incinerated. 76% is landfilled, and only 9% was recycled. So it's pretty terrible recycling rate, according to the US EPA. In reality, the recycling rate is actually lower. We have studied this and put out a report where we have estimated that it's closer to 5 to 6%. So if you want to look at our report, it's called The Real Truth About the US Plastics Recycling Rate. And we talk about the reasons for the rate being lower than what the EPA is estimating. So the only resin types that have recycling rates worth mentioning are number one, PET, and that's mostly your beverage bottles, water, juice. HDPE, number two, plastic. That's milk jugs, detergent bottles, some juice containers. While PET has a recycling rate of 29%, HDPE has an even lower rate of 27%. Now, both of those recycling rates are actually higher than they are in reality because there's something called the utilization rate, which means how much of the plastic collected and sent to a MRF, a materials recovery facility, how much and sold to an end user, how much of that actually ends up in a finished product. That's the utilization rate. So those rates are lower than 29 and 27%. And numbers 3 through 7, which include polystyrene, polypropylene, PVC, all of those are basically, and many other resins that, you know, have many names. Those are really not recyclable in the real world. A nationwide survey conducted by Greenpeace and the Last Beach Cleanup found that they surveyed about 350 materials recovery facilities across the country. And they asked them what kinds of plastics they accepted. And many of them don't accept numbers 3 through 7, and they cited insufficient market demand and difficulties with processing capabilities as the reason for their non-acceptance. Sometimes when numbers 3 through 7 are taken to a MRF by a curbside recycling program, they're really not even getting recycled. They're not being sold as recycling. They end up in the residue stream. So because they're too contaminated, because there's no buyer, buyer dried up. So basically what you see on those arrows that are the chasing arrows on the bottom of each product with the numbers 1 through 7, a lot of people think that those arrows mean that the product is recyclable. In fact, what those numbers mean is it identifies the resin code. It doesn't necessarily mean that product is recyclable in the real world. So we believe this whole situation is in violation of the green guides put out by the Federal Trade Commission. And there are many groups out there that are pursuing getting the FTC to take action on the misleading labeling of these resin codes. Why has what we call mechanical or conventional recycling failed to capture more plastic? There's a technical problem, and that is the plastic itself. As Bethany so expertly explained, plastic was never designed to be recycled. There are thousands of different chemicals in there that are toxic. There are many different resin types. the resin types are incompatible with each other in the recycling process. And the graphic shows how many materials recovery facilities won't even accept so many of the commonly used products that we use in our daily lives. And as I said, the additives are also compatible with each other. Moreover, they're often too toxic to use in food grade products. So you can't have a closed loop recycling process because you don't want people drinking out of plastic bottles that contain, brominated flame retardants or whatever. Who knows what kind of additives were in the plastics used for that. The next challenge is economic. Curbside collection is expensive. There has to be a whole separate truck fleet, separate from garbage collection, drivers, public education programs, municipal recycling coordinators. So all of this is so expensive that there are swaths of the United States that don't even have curbside recycling programs. Like my town doesn't have one, as a matter of fact. I live out in Western Massachusetts, and it's just too expensive for my town to have that. We have a drop-off center at the transfer station, and I really have no way of knowing how faithful people are being when they take their stuff in. I do know that when I look into the roll-off container where I dump my containers, that there are tons of things in there that don't belong. They're only supposed to be beverage and food containers, but people put in flower pots, clothes hangers, just every manner of thing that has nothing to do with beverage containers or food containers. And those are all going to end up as residue. And we call this wish cycling. So it's too expensive for a lot of towns to have curbside collection. Sorting at the MRF is also expensive. The materials recovery facilities themselves are multi-million-dollar plants. They require a lot of labor as well. Finally, there's a lack of markets. Recycled plastic just can't compete with virgin plastic. It's that simple. Virgin plastic made from fossil fuels is still cheap, and it's economies of scale, it's subsidies, and the recycling industry just isn't well developed enough to compete, and they don't really have a chance to compete because of subsidies. Finally, there's a political challenge. It's a lack of will, and it's industry opposition. There's a dearth of regulation out there. Mandatory recycling is very rare, and beverage container recycling programs, which are very effective at recovering beverage containers, they have been stalled out at only 10 US states for 2 decades. And that was actually my prior career before I came to Beyond Plastics. I worked for the Container Recycling Institute, and I worked on bottle bills for many years. And during my decades of working with CRI, we got 1 new bottle bill passed in Hawaii in 2005. And the rest of the 20 years we spent trying to prevent the industry from advancing repeals in the 10 US states and preventing updates to bills, like to raise the deposit from 5 to 10 cents. And just so the Coke, Pepsi, the beer companies, they've all opposed deposit laws. And the materials companies did for a long time too, the container manufacturers. But there's been a reversal now. The container manufacturers don't have enough material to use, and so they are promoting deposit legislation, which is great, but it still hasn't been enough to counter industry opposition. So what, underlying all of this is, we know that industry doesn't want deposits because they don't want to pay for it. They don't want to pay for the collection, which is what they have to do under a deposit return scheme. But that's not what they're telling the public. What they're telling the public is that it's an issue of personal responsibility. It's our responsibility. We're not recycling, right? We're doing it wrong. We're putting flower pots in the roll-off, and they don't belong there. And they're not taking any responsibility for their own failures of making a product that's truly recyclable, isn't toxic, and doesn't end up contaminating the environment and all of our bodies, as we heard from the previous speakers. So all of those challenges also exist for another technology called chemical recycling, which I'll get to in a moment. But first, I want to say that the plastics industry has known all along about these challenges, and they knew that plastic wasn't recyclable. They just weren't telling us. We issued a report last year, which I'll show you in a moment, and Lou Freeman wrote the foreword to our report. He was the vice president of the public affairs at the Society of the Plastics Industry, which is a lobbying group. He was VP from 1979 to 2001, pretty long tenure. By the way, they're now called the Plastics Industry Association, or simply plastics in all capital letters. And so he was a proponent, and he sort of had this big turnaround where he feels bad for being part of this deception. And he wrote a report for us saying, among other things, in the 1980s, companies spent millions of dollars convincing the public that plastics recycling would work, even though they knew it wouldn't. It has taken the industry 35 years to increase the plastics recycling rate from 1% to 9%. And it now claims that in just half that time, it will recycle 100% of its products. And now they're saying advanced recycling can turn waste plastic into brand new plastic for use in virtually any plastic product or packaging. So after 50 years, it's become pretty impossible to ignore that conventional plastics recycling or mechanical plastics recycling has been a failure. And the industry even admits it. This slide the picture is from the American Chemistry Council. That's a lobbying group for the petrochemical industry, including plastics suppliers. And they say more than 90% of all plastics aren't being recycled. But their response to that isn't to manufacture less plastics, as we just heard from the previous speaker. I mean, that is really the answer to this massive problem that we're in. But instead, they're saying the solution is advanced recycling. Like, we know mechanical recycling didn't work because too many plastic products are not recyclable, but advanced recycling will fix all of that. And there are other terms besides advanced recycling and chemical recycling. You might have heard molecular recycling, depolymerization, solvolysis, solvent-based purification. There are many different terms used depending on the technical process and depending on how vague the industry wants to be in any situation. In the United States, though, the most common technology being used is pyrolysis. Pyrolysis uses high heat, so 250 to 700 degrees Celsius, and high pressure to convert plastics to a liquid in an oxygen-free reactor vessel. The yields include fuels, sometimes they call them mixed hydrocarbons, gases, oils, waxes, and char, which is a solid charcoal-like waste substance. So depending on the desired end use, a lot of further treatment might be required to remove toxic contaminants and other contaminants that aren't compatible with the recycling process or even the fuel burning process. And all of that upgrading is expensive, and it generates more hazardous wastes. In addition to these fuels I just named, pyrolysis also creates hazardous waste. When we did our report, we found that three large quantity generators were registered with the EPA, and that's Regenix in Oregon, Alterra in Ohio, and Bravin in North Carolina. There was one small quantity generator, PureCycle in Ohio, and the remaining 7 others weren't listed as with the EPA, probably because the quantity they were the throughput that they were using and the quantity that they produced just fell below the EPA's reporting threshold. When we looked at EPA data for Regenix in Oregon, we found that over the course of 10 years, they generated 1 ton of hazardous waste for every 3 tons of waste plastic processed. These hazardous wastes included ignitable wastes and oily sludges containing benzene, toluene, xylene, 1,2-dichloroethane, and heavy metals, among other hazardous compounds. So those are the solid and liquid hazardous wastes. The air emissions include NOx and VOCs, which contribute to smog, sulfur dioxide that can damage the lungs, soot and particulate matter that can trigger asthma and heart attacks, and carbon monoxide, which inhibits oxygen intake to the heart and brain. We also found that 8 of the 11 constructed plants in the US are in areas with lower than average levels of income, and 5 are in areas with higher than average concentrations of people of color. So this is an environmental justice issue. And to learn more about the things I just talked about, you can download our 2023 report, Chemical Recycling, A Dangerous Deception. It's on our website. So as I said, in September 2023, there were 11 constructed chemical recyclings in the chemical recycling facilities in the US. And we called them constructed because it really wasn't clear if they were all actually operating. We knew that many of them were not operating at their full rated capacities, and we knew that several of them had periodic closures or were operating intermittently. And we found that even if all 11 were operating at their maximum capacity, they still would have only been able to manage 1.3% of the plastic discarded in the US, the 35 million tons I told you about before. But in 2024, 3 of those 11 plants closed. Regenix in Oregon, the plant I told you about where it was a 1-to-3 ratio of hazardous waste to plastic waste. They were supposed to take post-consumer polystyrene and convert it into styrene monomer, which is the building blocks of polystyrene. They shut down in April after sustaining operating losses of $22.4 million in 2020 and 2021. Then Fulcrum in Nevada, they were taking household trash or garbage and using gasification to convert it into so-called sustainable aviation fuel. The plant closed in May, laying off 100 employees, and they declared bankruptcy in September, despite having received over $1 billion with a B dollars of private investment and upwards of $100 million in federal subsidies. And they have more than 200 creditors trying to get their money back. Finally, New Hope in Texas is the newest plant we just learned about. They took mixed plastic waste, but not PVC. So try separating that out from mixed plastic waste, and you start to see how expensive it is. And their stated outputs included fuels, asphalt, and chemical and plastic feedstocks. Their closure was confirmed in October. So what's next for the industry? According to Oil and Gas Watch, there are 47 chemical recycling facilities that are proposed or are already under construction. Most probably won't get built due to the technical challenges I mentioned earlier and due to the difficulty of raising capital. There are also a wide variety of legal challenges coming from different states, but time doesn't allow us to get into that here. The biggest legal challenge to date comes from the California Attorney General, who you may have heard filed a lawsuit recently against ExxonMobil for harms incurred from plastic pollution. The logic of the lawsuit goes something like this. ExxonMobil has waged a 50-year campaign of deception on the merits of plastic recycling. You saw this before on the Lou Friedman slide. They kept telling the public, don't worry, we've got this. This deception effectively prevented large public outcry about rising plastic pollution. The outcry would have resulted in a translation into bans, polystyrene bans, bag bans, single-use plastic bans, etc. And this absence of public pressure effectively enabled the plastic production to increase unfettered. And that, as we know, has resulted in massive plastic pollution. So we'll be watching this case study very carefully over the next few years, and we'll be encouraging other attorneys general in states across the country to replicate this lawsuit in their states using the same national information that California AG developed, but substituting their own state-specific harms from plastic pollution. So we'll keep an eye on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny. That was an excellent presentation on a very, very challenging topic. I was writing frantically, trying to make sure I got some of those things down. And we'll follow up with you more in the panel discussion. At this time, we are going to turn to Sarah Au. Sarah, if you're ready to share your presentation. Sarah, this is shifting gears a little bit back. Many of you joined us in the policy session earlier today. Sarah's going to expand farther on the TSCA prioritization process and the 5 chemicals that are currently being proposed. And Sarah, I will let you take it away. I recognize that building. I'm from around DC and used to walk by there all the time. But all right, Sarah.
Hey, Agnes and everybody. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Alrighty. And I apologize. I am trying to, oops, I'm so sorry.
You're
I
fine.
tested this out earlier and it's, I'm not able to turn on my camera. So apologies, everybody. But in the interest of time, I'll just get started. So yeah, good morning. My name is Sarah O. I am one of the lead toxicologists in the Data Gathering Management Policy Division within the Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics. I really appreciate everybody here giving me a chance today to present a general overview of prioritization and some of our current prioritization efforts that we are engaged in to evaluate the potential risks of existing industrial chemicals regulated under the Toxic Substance Control Act, otherwise known as TSCA. So this is just a quick summary of the various topics that I'll be just going over, including a high-level overview of TSCA in regards to existing chemicals programs, requirements and timelines for prioritization, our general approach for identifying candidates that may be selected for future prioritization efforts, information sources that we generally consider, exposure to communities, and that type of information that we find very useful, and just a general summary. So under the TSCA, the nation's primary chemicals management law, EPA has the authority to require reporting, record keeping, and testing requirements and restrictions relating to chemical substances and mixtures. When TSCA was amended in 2016, which received bipartisan support under Section 6 for existing chemicals, EPA is required to implement a prioritization process that will determine whether those chemical substances should undergo risk evaluation to determine whether there is unreasonable risk to the health or the environment without the consideration of costs or non-risk factors based on the weight of scientific evidence using the best available science. Under TSCA, EPA is required to consider cradle to grave chemical life cycles, which in which a chemical may be regulated at any point in that process and is broader in scope than a lot of the media-specific statutes that are also being worked on within the agency. EPA considers potential exposure and effects resulting from any use. Because TSCA requires and considers a lot of factors throughout a chemical's life cycle to determine potential exposure and risk, it takes approximately 6 years to initiate prioritization, conduct risk evaluation for chemical substances that are designated as high priority substances, determine whether there is unreasonable risk for identified conditions of use, and as warranted, impose restrictions to address the unreasonable risk that was identified. This process takes some time to identify and receive reasonably available and potentially relevant information, and then conduct the analysis necessary to address different requirements of each phase of evaluating risk for existing chemicals under TSCA. There are tens of thousands of chemicals active in commerce and regulated under TSCA. All of them may be subject to risk evaluation under TSCA Section 6. This slide focuses on the prioritization step specifically, which begins with the identification of chemical substances undergoing prioritization during which initiation, which starts the clock on that 9 to 12 month prioritization process. There are 2 statutorily mandated 90-day public comment periods during prioritization. Once a chemical is identified during initiation, there is a binary decision that must be made where, based on the public comments and screening review of reasonably available information regarding the prioritization criteria and considerations, whether a chemical meets the requirements to be a high priority for risk evaluations or be designated as a low priority substance, for which risk evaluation is not required at this time. The 3 to 3.5 year time frame for conducting the draft and final draft risk evaluations will then begin for any chemicals having the final designation as a high priority substance. And I wanted to reiterate, once we initiate prioritization for chemical substances, there's no off-ramping. EPA must make a designation as either a high or low priority substance. So, as discussed in the previous slide, prioritization is a 9 to 12-month process where EPA identifies, proposes, and finalizes the designation of chemical substances as either high or low priority substances. There are considerations for both identifying the chemicals that will undergo prioritization, as well as 7 considerations and criteria that must be met to make this determination, and those will be described in an upcoming slide. In short, prioritization is a process for identifying which chemicals have sufficient reasonably available information for determining whether there may be risk. For chemicals where there is a likelihood of there being risk, those chemicals will undergo risk evaluation once there is a final designation as a high priority substance. For chemicals where it's unlikely for there to be risk based on reasonably available information, those chemicals will not undergo risk evaluation at this time, and that chemical can be readdressed in the future should there be no new information. And we generally plan on conducting prioritization annually to replace the completed risk evaluations for high priority substances that are currently ongoing. EPA must first identify chemical substances that will undergo prioritization. For the identification of chemical substances that will undergo prioritization, EPA draws at least 50% of the chemical substances from the 2014 TSCA work plan. This helps to ensure that EPA satisfy the TSCA prioritization framework rules requirement that at least half of the ongoing TSCA risk evaluations are for chemicals on that 24 TSCA work plan, until all the chemical substances on that list has been designated as either a high or low priority substance. The 2014 work plan was updated from efforts begun in 2012 by EPA to characterize a subset of chemicals in commerce that may pose risk to human health and the environment, to advance the existing chemicals program so that those with the highest potential for exposure and hazard are assessed. These chemicals are not a finding by the agency that there is risk, but rather a jumping off point to quickly identify existing chemicals that the agency should consider for risk evaluation. Of those that are identified from the work plan, there's a preference for those that are persistent bioaccumulated in the environment, carcinogenic, and have demonstrated toxicological effects resulting from acute or chronic exposure. This is generally the starting point by law for at least half of our work. After identifying the chemical substances that will undergo prioritization, EPA will use the same considerations listed here to determine whether a chemical substance is a high or low priority for conducting a risk evaluation. And those are the hazard and exposure potential of the chemical substance, persistence and bioaccumulation, potentially exposed or susceptible subpopulations, storage near significant sources of drinking water, the conditions of use or significant changes in the conditions of use of the chemical substance, the volume or significant changes in the volume of the chemical substance manufactured or processed, and other risk-based criteria that EPA determines to be relevant to the designation of the chemical substance's priority for possible risk evaluation action. EPA's approach for identifying chemical substances that would undergo prioritization considered both chemicals that are on and off the 2014 TSCA work plan. Data availability regarding exposure and hazard information are of great significance to reduce the likelihood that EPA may need to order testing to evaluate the potential risk and to determine whether the reasonably available information is robust enough to support a risk evaluation that can be completed within a statutorily mandated timeline of 3.5 years. Data availability was a strong consideration as it takes a decent amount of time to identify that information, assess gaps in data needs for a given chemical to support a potential test order before even getting that data. EPA has largely coordinated with other EPA offices as well as other interested parties and stakeholders throughout the pre-prioritization timeframe, and will continue to do so throughout the whole process and annual efforts. This slide indicates some of the information sources that may be used to inform different aspects of characterizing potential exposure. Many of these sources are databases that contain both primary and/or secondary information. It takes time to consider what information may be duplicative across many sources, as well as determine what may be potentially relevant for a given chemical. However, this type of data analysis must be conducted so that EPA can understand how robust a chemicals data landscape actually is, while also considering work already done to be efficient, inclusive, and transparent. Monitoring information from various databases is particularly useful because there are instances when monitoring information available in peer-reviewed literature is unable to really address the scope of what we are mandated to address under a statute as comprehensive as TSCA, where facility-specific releases must be characterized. A lot of folks here may be familiar with this list, but these are actually the 5 chemical substances that we are currently proposing to designate as high priority substances. We released these proposed designation documents in July, and those chemicals include 4,4-prime methylene bis 2-chloroaniline. It's primarily used in the manufacturing and processing of chemicals such as rubbers, plastics, and resins. Acetaldehyde, which is also used to manufacture and process other chemicals such as adhesives and other petrochemicals. It's also used for intermediates for various products like packaging and construction materials. Acrylonitrile is used in the manufacturing and processing of chemicals such as plastics, paints, and other petrochemicals. Benzenamine, which is used for the manufacturing and processing of other chemicals such as dyes, pigments, plastics, and other petrochemicals. And as most folks here are familiar with, vinyl chloride, which the primary use of this is the manufacturing and processing of chemicals that are used to create plastics such as PVC. But the importance of this slide is to just give an overview of the various uses that we've identified, but also the general landscape and how differing they can be regarding other office interests, coverage by existing assessments, and the general hazard and exposure profiles that may be available for various chemicals. Right? As communicated in September and October this year, we released a list of about 27 candidate chemical substances for future prioritization actions. This slide is one of 2 that depicts a high-level summary of information on those 27 chemicals currently being considered for future prioritization actions, including but not limited to existing assessments by and interests of other agencies and government bodies. And whether there are data submitted to OPPT under the chemical data reporting or the toxic release inventory, which are generally used as indicators of use and release information. These are indicators of whether there is hazard and/or exposure information using reasonably available information. I'll just go to the next slide. As indicated from the previous slide, reasonably available information for hazard and exposure particularly was a priority when considering chemical substances for upcoming prioritization efforts. Similar to the previous slide, the gray color represents chemical substances being considered that are on the remaining 2014 TSCA work plan and are specifically categories that may encompass multiple chemicals. The chemical substances that are blue are not on the 2014 TSCA work plan and are being considered due to various agency interests. Specifically, hydrogen fluoride and 6-PPD were chemicals of interest from the TSCA Section 21 petitions. And we identified BPS as being of interest. Bisphenol S, should BPA undergo prioritization, which is one of the chemicals on the 2014 work plan. BPS is one of the main alternative phthalates being used on the market for BPA. So I'm going to briefly go into the types of information that we find particularly useful to help characterize exposure. By implementing the process to evaluate the potential risk of existing chemicals, EPA is committed to reducing exposure to communities and individuals. To do so, having the most relevant information is crucial to better characterize how people are being exposed via different activities and environments, which I believe a lot of people so far have already stressed in this session. Specifically, there are types and sources of information that communities or individuals may have access to that EPA isn't aware of. That would allow us to characterize potential exposure and hazard, such as perhaps facility emissions release data, environmental monitoring data resulting from activities near communities, product data, such as consumer products or uses, chemical concentrations found in or used to manufacture or process certain products, use information, how products may be used by different individuals and groups, and activities or use patterns, such as those that may lead to a greater exposure are of particular importance to us so that we don't overgeneralize. And so let me go on to the next slide. TSCA applies to potential exposures that may occur anywhere in the chain, but not releases associated with the manufacturing, production, import, distribution, use, or disposal of products that fall outside of TSCA, such as drugs. Depending on how relevant the data are to the chemical exposure pathway, conditions of use, or potentially exposed susceptible subpopulation, this determines how the data may be used in that analysis. Concentrations of chemicals that individuals are exposed to at or near a workplace are of particular importance. Process operational descriptions can often inform this potential worker exposure, such as the physical state of a chemical, type and size of containers carrying the chemical, how and when that chemical may be transformed or reacted with other chemicals at a particular step in the manufacturing process. Downstream facilities in which chemicals are incorporated into different products are particularly harder to characterize, as already communicated in previous presentations. Therefore, we would also like to stress that supply chain information is also crucial for characterizing commercial and consumer potential exposures. So generally, we've come to the conclusion, but the goal is for EP to design and implement a data gathering process that will inform annual prioritization and potential risk evaluation management needs. This will be done earlier and on a continued basis so that the input and information provided by various stakeholders and individuals can be considered, and this will also help EP identify data needs early in the process and inform as well potential legal and authority needs. The earlier characterization of potential exposure and hazard of industrial chemicals will generally help with the intent to meet statutory deadlines and ultimately reduce chemical exposure. Every year, potential candidates will may change. Therefore, having this information submitted to the agency annually is also useful for identifying chemicals that have sufficient information to make the may present unreasonable risk call during prioritization. And I just wanted to kind of touch base and give everybody an update that, the public comment periods regarding both the prioritization, the proposed designation of the 5 chemical substances currently undergoing prioritization, as well as the public comment period regarding the 27 candidates identified for future prioritization actions recently closed in October. And as always, I appreciate your time. And thank you all so much for giving me the opportunity to present. Thanks, Agnes.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I think that was a great follow-up to what many people heard in the policy session earlier today, and certainly gives us a lot to think about based off of everyone else's presentations in this session. We have a few minutes to ask some questions to all of our speakers. If our speakers are comfortable turning their cameras back on. We had prepared some questions on our side, but a very interesting question was posed in the chat, which I want to uplift and make sure that everyone has a chance to speak to, and that the audience understands. One of our audience members asked the questions about bio-based plastics, whether that is a good or poor global direction for replacing some of our traditional plastics. And I want to add, would someone, perhaps Bethany or Alex, be able to speak a little bit, or Jenny also, about some of the specific concerns around bio-based plastics, and particularly that feedstock and also the end of life of bio-based plastics, how they might differ from traditional plastics, and what we should be keeping in mind as we explore them?
Yeah, I think both Jenny and I are eager to get on this one. So
Yeah,
I
go first.
I did put a quick response in the chat there, but just stressing that when we're shifting to new resources, we need to consider potential burden shifting that might occur then if, for example, using something that could be a food source or affecting land system uses and changes like that. If you're using corn or sugar, you can also impact water usage and pesticide usage and other impacts like that, just at the very early stage on like resource extraction. So that needs to be considered. then the bioplastics themselves will contain additives and other chemicals. And a number of studies have shown that they're as toxic, if not in some cases more toxic than traditional plastics. And these can also leach out into foodstuffs, and they can lead to human exposure. So these are already demonstrated impacts that need to be considered. They're not inherently better because they're bio-based. And then when it comes to end of life, there is some misconceptions, and I think in some case purposefully miscommunications about using the word bioplastic instead of bio-based plastic or biodegradable plastic. So those terms can sometimes be a little bit muddled together. A bio-based plastic is not necessarily biodegradable, and a biodegradable plastic is not necessarily a bio-based plastic. Fossil fuel-based plastics can be made to be biodegradable, and so on. So we need to be very clear in terminology. But if we're talking about bio-based plastics, they're not necessarily biodegradable. You can use a bioresource to make polypropylene or another traditional plastic, or you can use it to make something like PLA or something that should be biodegradable. But studies are also showing that biodegradable plastics don't necessarily biodegrade as they're marketed or like sort of told to be. So they'll sometimes require industrial composting. They won't necessarily biodegrade in backyard compost. They won't biodegrade in marine systems if they end up in the environment. So that's a problem. They will also contaminate and degrade recycling systems. So it's not an easy shift to go from traditional plastics to bio-based plastics. There's a lot of things that need to be considered.
Yeah.
I'll stop there and let Jenny jump in.
I do see Jenny's hand coming up in
you
real life.
covered about 90% of what I wanted to say, and you did it very well. So I'll just add a couple of things. People do confuse bioplastics, biodegradable and compostable. And you're right about how, I don't know if people picked up on that when you go to a restaurant and you get your leftovers in a container. I got one just the other day. It says compostable on it. It won't degrade in your backyard compost heap. I've tried it, and it's actually really disgusting. What happens is it fragments into lots of small pieces. And if I'd known we were going to talk about this, I would have brought photos, because I have great photos of the fragments kind of wrecking my soil. So the other issue is that the biodegradability thing, a lot of people think, well, even if it's not recyclable and there's no municipal industrial compost facility in my region, at least it'll biodegrade in the landfill. And that's a major red herring, because landfills are, in order to biodegrade, you need oxygen and you need moisture. And landfills are designed specifically to prevent oxygen and moisture from getting in. Like when they're closed at the end of their life, they put these big, thick clay caps on top of them, and they have leachate collection systems. So like a landfill is basically a sacrifice zone. It doesn't matter whether something biodegrades in there or not, because nothing productive is ever going to happen on the site of that landfill. And so it's really something that it's misleading labeling. It makes the public feel good about something they're buying, and it has no basis in reality.
Thank you both for your answers. Alex or Sarah, did you want to weigh in on this question about bio-based plastics?
Oh.
I have to make sure to get my term right now.
Oh, Agnes, sorry to interrupt. Just one more thing. I just put in the chat, Beyond Plastics just published a report a couple months ago called Demystifying Compostable and Biodegradable Plastics.
Mm-hmm.
And it's written for the layman. It's not hard to read. It's not long. And the link's in the chat.
Perfect. Thank you. So this question was very much timely for both of you. Alex or Sarah, do you want to weigh in at all?
I think almost everything has been covered perfectly.
Okay.
So,
well, Sarah, I want to
tell another quick story that's connected to the question around conflicts of interest.
Certainly.
And these plastics. So the industry, I mean, I put a publication and a policy brief in the chat there. And industry does use some sort of ugly tactics to undermine science or to delay policy. There's books written on this, Nomeorexis, The Merchants of Doubt, and the tactics that are used. And some of them that they use are to try to discredit scientific publications or scientists themselves. And the bioplastics industry has been doing this with academic scientists that are producing papers. I myself was a victim of this when I produced a paper on coffee cups and to go like single-use cups, and said that the paper or bio-based PLA plastics are not less toxic than the other plastics cups. And I would, yeah, they wrote articles about me. They accused me of undermining their business model and so on and so forth. So this is a tactic that this industry has been using very aggressively. I've seen both from the US-based industry and the European-based industry, and a number of my colleagues have even been brought to court because of their publications around bio-based plastics. So just pointing to the kinds of conflicts of interest that we're seeing and experiencing.
Thank you. And actually a follow-up to this, so your story that you shared there, most of our audience are either working closely with companies, they work at facilities, they are part of, you know, a supply chain. And I wanted to ask the panel, given all of these issues and challenges about plastics, about recycling, how can a company be smart about navigating this world of plastic recycling, of plastics use essentiality, and also like what authorities or resources are out there for folks in the industry that they could begin to start researching some of this on their own, and beyond this session itself?
I have thoughts, but maybe someone else wants a chance to talk. I'll put myself in the queue.
Maybe I start by saying simply use as less plastic as possible and switch to reuse systems, switch to other safer materials. And also something that I witness like all the time is, I don't know if it's a EU thing, but everyone's talking about life cycle assessments. So how to find out what is a better alternative, but I sometimes find these life cycle assessments not very helpful. So I remember a presentation by a consultant showing like a plastic, whatever it was, contact material and a glass jar. And he said that a plastic is much better because the life cycle assessment shows this. So also keep in mind that life cycle assessments usually do not include health aspects. That's one thing. And so I would say just try to switch to better alternatives, use as less plastic as possible, and also think about reuse systems. So it's, of course, it's not for everyone, and this is very basic, I would say. But when I talk to consumers, then I also say, just think what your grandma did. It's not about going back in time, but it sometimes gives a good idea of what can be done. And who to contact in the US, I have no clue. So I leave this to the other speakers.
So I see Jenny waving her hand. I'll put my
Just
hand up.
briefly, Beyond Plastics is really devoted. We are an advocacy organization. Like, we train volunteers, we do legislative work. Most of the time businesses are opposing what we do, like, because we're trying to limit food packaging production. But we also work with businesses who do reuse, who sell products that are reusable. And we are open to working with businesses who want to convert their product lines. And we won't necessarily tell you, we can't tell you how to do it technically, but we can talk to you about some of the things that the public wants and give you examples of where reuse has been adopted. So beyondplastics.org, or contact me.
Yeah. And then I just put a link in the chat to the Scientist Coalition page where we've collected our outputs, and it's sort of our target audience there is negotiators and maybe non-experts, but we have fact sheets that explain some pretty like basic facts about plastics and plastics chemicals and different concepts around plastics. But we also have some policy briefs that are very relevant to the kinds of policies we could see to make plastics use better. So reiterating again what Alexandra said and Jenny, shifting away from, so like waste hierarchy, for step, like reduce, less plastics, less chemicals, looking at where we really need products and the materials and chemicals that are necessary for the functioning of life and for the safety for humans. And the other ones, like we should just not make those, right? We need to legislate against that. Then also increasing transparency, so we know what's in the products that we're using, how much is being produced and where it's going. Shifting into reuse, refill systems, and that's going to require new infrastructure and new systems. It might require some public-private partnerships around financing to build out these systems, to consider a just transition, making sure that people throughout the plastics life cycles are safe, that they have protection for their health and for their families, but they also have ways to ensure their economies, that they have jobs and educations, that they can keep working as we shift away from plastics. So there's a lot of things to be considered here, and a lot of things that we can do as a global society and even locally within our communities to do this better. It's going to require some pretty significant shifts, though. So you can go and have a look at a lot of those documents there. They've all been written by our scientists and internally reviewed by our scientists. So they've been harshly critiqued, and I think they're of high credibility.
Well, it is 11:30 a.m., at least for us in the Eastern time zone. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. This session, it could have gone on for like 4 hours, and I think that we would not have even scraped the surface of their expertise and knowledge. So I just want to extend very, very grateful. We're very, very grateful for your time. For our folks in the audience, we have recorded this presentation. We are considering making it public, but we will also make sure that all of those links and wonderful documents and resources that were placed in the chat, we will summarize those and make sure to send those out to all of you. So please don't worry about frantically downloading things from the chat in the next couple seconds. And yeah, just to be respectful of everyone's time. We're going to wrap up the session now. Thank you once again to our speakers. Thank you, Pam, for helping host. And yeah, I hope to see all of you all soon. And very good luck for those of you traveling to Busan to continue those negotiations. But thank you.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great day, folks.